Hello, everyone, and welcome to Senior Living Live. My name is Janae Sherman, and I'm so glad you could be with us for our first webinar of the new year, Navigating Hospital Admissions. Our guest today, Katy Catuara, will be sharing the ways you and your senior family members can prepare ahead for unexpected hospital stays. Our webinar today is live, and we want you to be a part of the conversation. Katy will be available after her presentation to answer any and all of your questions. If and when you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type it in. I will read those to Katy afterwards so she can get you the answers you need. This webinar should be about 1 hour long, so make sure to get to your questions before we're done. So let's get started. Katy, thank you so much for being here with us today. The webinar is all yours.
Thanks so much, Janae. I appreciate the introduction. Like Janae said, my name is Katy Catuara. I am a regional director for a hospital system on the south side of Chicago, North Shore Edward-Elmhurst. I work overseeing the care management and social work teams, so navigating hospital stays is my expertise. What I'm going to start with today is discussing some of the differences between the types of hospitalizations that can occur, particularly in older and at-risk populations. We do a lot of planned care these days. So several times people do encounter a hospital stay on a planned basis, and this would be an expected hospital stay. There's also lots of instances where people will have unexpected or unplanned hospital stays. So I want to get into some of the details regarding this. There's a couple main points I'd like to make regarding the differences. So an expected stay sometimes would be called planned, and these would be very commonly for surgical times that you come in for a procedure that's set, planned in the outpatient basis after you see your provider, and you'll come directly into the hospital and you'll have your procedure or your surgery done. Sometimes you have to have specific testing done that does require a subsequent hospital stay, and that is planned and expected in advance. There's also circumstances where people have chronic treatment, and this has to be done on a routine basis, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, maybe every 6 or 8 weeks, but you have to be hospitalized for monitoring, or the period of time that you're receiving the treatment is long enough to be hospitalized for. So there are several instances in which people have to be hospitalized on a planned basis, surprisingly. Also, there's the unexpected times that this happens. Very commonly, patients are sent from an outpatient setting after they see one of their providers, and they need to be hospitalized directly to a room for care at hospital level services. Very commonly, patients come to the emergency department and find that they have some kind of surprise condition or deterioration in their diagnosis or disease, and they have to be hospitalized for immediate treatment or further evaluation. Also, sometimes all of these columns here, or all these points here in the left-hand column that I have listed, these expected reasons, can unfortunately at times turn into an unexpected admission. So there are instances, although it's rare, it's very rare, because we've gotten really good at predicting what should be planned and can go home from the hospital. There are times where people just don't do as well with recovering, or they have an unexpected event occur while they're under our care. They were planning on leaving the hospital, but they actually have to stay for some continued stay. So any of your expected admissions can actually technically turn into an unexpected admission. So my main point with the difference is, if you're having a hospital stay for any reason, you can take all of the information I give you here during this webinar and apply it to any circumstance that you may find yourself in if you're encountering a hospital system for your care. So one of the main things that we talk about when being prepared for hospitalizations and care are the kind of documents that you may need or may want to have. So there's a lot of very official healthcare documents out there. One thing I want to share with everybody and be very clear about is you are not required to have these formal healthcare documents to receive any type of hospital care. It is not required. These are documents that are a preference. And as I get into them, you may better understand why it's important, or it may be important to you to have some of these in place in advance of a hospital encounter. So most of these are appropriate for older people or high-risk people, patients that may need either chronic ongoing treatment or are high risk for acute, unexpected situations. And it's very important for you to have these if you want to pre-plan who's going to help you with decision making. So a lot of these documents that I'm going to talk about really have an underlying theme of who and how would you like your care if you are in a serious medical situation, particularly if you cannot make decisions for yourself. So the main point of a lot of these are to outline basically how you would want your care to be delivered, how you'd like to receive your care, what you'd want your healthcare experience to be if you weren't able to dictate your choices at that time. So it's in the event that you would be unable to make these decisions yourself, if you have specific people in your life that you know you want involved in this decision making, if it were to ever happen. And also to note, otherwise, without this is state dictated. So like I said at the beginning of this slide, you are not required to have this information, these documents to receive care. We will treat you if you present to any hospital with any medical condition or illness that needs such treatment. But one thing to note is if you do not have these people detailed out or these documents line items, your particular state, whatever state you live in, has a decision tree and guidance for healthcare providers on who they should go to. So the most common example of this is a spouse. So usually if somebody comes into the hospital and they are unable to make decisions for themselves, unfortunately, at some point, and that patient has a spouse, that would be the default person to make decisions for them if they do not have healthcare documents. These healthcare documents I'm going to review otherwise supersede that. So if you have specific people in your life that you want involved in your care in this way, it's important to detail this out, because otherwise it is really dependent on state and local regulations and rules that healthcare providers will follow to help facilitate decision-making for your care. Also, it's really essential to consult your healthcare provider and or lawyer when developing these documents. So there are a lot of resources out there, and your healthcare provider can definitely help have these discussions with you to understand what you want out of your care. And some of these documents do require a legal representation or consultation to execute them. So it's very important, depending on what you want, to have these people involved when developing these. The best place to start, I recommend, is whoever your core or primary healthcare provider is. So if you have a primary care physician that you see routinely and you are close with and knows your care well, that's the person you're going to start with. If you have a specialist because you have a chronic condition that you see routinely and have a good relationship with, for example, let's say you have heart failure, you have a cardiologist that you see. Even if it's a mid-level provider or a nurse practitioner, a lot of people see nurse practitioners these days. Who do you have a good relationship with? Also, another example would be maybe COPD. Do you have a pulmonologist, that specialty area that you see routinely, the person that you see the most, that you have the best relationship with, that understands your journey that you've had with your chronic illness, might be the best place to start this conversation. So that's where you want to initiate talking about these if you don't have them already. The other thing I would add at this point is when you're talking to your healthcare providers, if you have a lot of these documents already, or even one of these documents already, they can always be updated and changed. So it's important to recognize that as you advance in your disease processes, or maybe you have a new condition or a change in what's going on with your medical status, it is important to discuss these things, and you can update and adjust these documents as you go through the process. So it is not finite and concrete. These can be revoked or removed at any time. And additionally, they can be updated as you have these conversations. So really important last point there to continually keep in touch with your first and foremost primary source of medical treatment, whoever your big contact is from a provider perspective that you spend the most time with taking care of yourself. And then second to that, a lawyer can help with these documents as well. So what documents am I talking about? These are advanced directives. The first one I'm going to go through is called a living will. A living will is by design to generally lay out your wishes and the type of care you want to receive. It in a very general fashion, explains what you want out of your healthcare experience while you're engaging in the healthcare system and needing to receive healthcare services. The second one is a power of attorney. So this is what I was talking about when I mentioned decision making. A medical power of attorney is very specific around who will help make decisions for you or with you. So let me talk about that a little bit further. When you have a power of attorney and you develop one, execute one with a lawyer, and you have that document, it doesn't immediately mean that somebody else will make your healthcare decisions for you. This can be written in several different ways. A very common misnomer is that healthcare power of attorney now makes all your decisions for you, and that is not the case. This is actually most commonly written in a form where it is only enacted if you can no longer make decisions for yourself. And that can be fluid as well. So let's take a case example on this. Let's say you have to be hospitalized for a planned procedure. You need general anesthesia. You go into the hospital, you have your procedure done, you are under anesthesia, and you have something happen during the procedure where a decision has to be made. The doctor comes out, talks to whoever your person is with you, and if you have a healthcare power of attorney delineated, there will be a decision that is brought to that person. So if you want to have a very clear, delineated person identified to make decisions for you when you can't, that's what this healthcare power of attorney is for. So that doctor would then at that time contact the power of attorney, whether they're the person there with you at the hospital as your care partner, or if that's a phone call that needs to be made. Sometimes it's somebody that might not even be in a different, in the same state as you, might be in a different state, but they are your decision maker when you are unable. So they help make that decision for you. You finish out your surgery, you are waking up from anesthesia, and now you're back to being able to make decisions, right? So it's not like a light switch. It doesn't turn on when it's activated and signed. It doesn't turn on once the document is delivered. It can be once you are unable to make decisions or need help making decisions. And then also through the continuum of your care, there may be times where you can't make decisions, but then you are able to again. Another very common example of this is people that have unexpected traumatic events, like maybe a car accident or something very unexpected and catastrophic, like a heart attack, for example, and you may have to be sedated pretty quick when you come into the emergency department or given something for pain. And there's a spectrum of that as well, but there is a point where people need help making decisions for themselves, to consent for surgical procedures, to consent for certain treatments or medications. And that's where this power of attorney would be enacted. And once you're able to make decisions again, that can be brought back into your power. It's just depending on how you have it written up. It depends on what your preferences are. I can tell you that in my experience, there has been times where I have encountered patients and families or significant others or whatnot, and their power of attorney is just their decision maker. That's what they decided, but that's the exception to the rule. Most of the time, people have a power of attorney written for when and if they only need help or are unable to make their own decisions. And then the last and final document I wanted to talk about was a post or a provider orders for life-sustaining treatment. So this is formerly known and very commonly still known as a DNR or a do not resuscitate form or directive. It can provide very, very clear and more details than your living will would. Again, your living will is very general, written very generally. The post form will have directives that are very specific regarding nutrition, mechanical ventilation if you choose to do so. The main decision made with enacting a post is if you are going to choose to have CPR, if your heart and lungs were to stop, you can direct the healthcare team universally, every healthcare provider, regardless of if it's the fire department and paramedics that may be meeting you at your house or at your outpatient clinic services. Maybe you have infusions at an infusion center, whether it's when you go to the emergency department, you're in the actual hospital setting. This is a universal order that can direct specific care to the healthcare team universally. So this is something that if you are to the point in your progression of your disease or the point in your life where it does not make sense from a quality perspective to be resuscitated, and that is specific again to having CPR if your heart or lung were to stop, you would enact one of these. And then from there, more specifically, you can have directives about mechanical ventilation. So that's about being intubated and being on a ventilator, or nutrition status. So would you like to have artificial nutrition to help support you with whatever you have going on medically? And again, this is something that can go with you. It is not something that you have to renew or redo at every different healthcare level. It is something that is universal that you can carry with you and you can present, and is very valuable when you have to engage in a lot of healthcare, especially if you are very ill. It's most appropriate for patients who have serious illnesses and want to have control over their end of life of care and experiences. And again, it serves as an actual directive or medical order. So the post is very comprehensive. It is something that you can see on the internet as well. It is written in very simple layman's terms for the majority of the language on it, so it can be very easily read. And it is paramount that you talk to your healthcare provider about this one. So what I highly recommend is if this is something that you would consider or you want to have more control over in your life, or you have serious feelings about, discuss it with your healthcare provider. That is the first place to start. So let's talk a little bit more about talking to our healthcare team and providers. Now, this is, again, specific to navigating a hospital stay. So what do you want to ask your doctor and your care team when you're in the hospital? How do you communicate with them? What's the best way to get information? So right off the bat, my best advice to you is to designate one person. So many different organizations call this one person a different title. At North Shore Edward-Elmhurst, we call this a care partner. So this is somebody that's involved with all of your care, understands you and your healthcare concerns and issues, is most up to date with your treatment, and also can contact your VIP people. So who are the most important people to you, your friends, family, who you want to have information and who you don't, they can help manage that. It is incredibly difficult to communicate between multiple people and a very complex care team. So my first and probably most important word of advice here is to designate one person. And I think another thing to add here is planning this in advance, talking to somebody about this. Who is your person? Does your person know that they're your person? Do they know that you would depend on them for this and maybe you'd do the same for them? And does your family know that that's the one point of contact or the best point of contact? This helps because it makes sure that the care team is able to have one point of contact and can get them the most up-to-date information. And it also makes it a lot easier for your family and friends to have one source of information that will have the most up-to-date information. So there's always a question too about how often and how can I actually get updates. So that's one thing you actually want to ask. What's the frequency that I would be expected to be communicated to? And one thing I'll add, and I'll get into more detail of this, is a electronic medical record. So healthcare industry has pretty much universally implemented the medical record, and there's a lot of patient portals available now. So there's been a lot of advancements made over the last, I'd say, decade or so, in legislation and policy about accessing medical records and transparency with medical records and communication and test results and plans of care. And one of the best solutions to this, and a lot of organizations are going to it, is direct access to your medical records. So the most common one is MyChart. That's through Epic. A lot of people have MyChart. You might be familiar with this. And it's not the only way, but the most common one to be able to get updates and as frequently as you want regarding your care or your person's care. Another question that's really important to ask is, what is the main problem? And it's not necessarily diagnosis. I like the language problem because a lot of times when you're in the hospital, it is very complex and there's more than one thing going on. So really, what is the main problem we're trying to fix here? What are we concerned about? What's the problem? What tests are being ordered? So what testing are we doing? What treatments and medications are we having done for my care plan or my person's care plan? What does recovery look like? What does recovery from this look like? So I would be remiss to say that everybody comes out of the hospital looking better than they came in. We have ongoing therapies and treatments once people discharge, especially if it's something that is a little bit more acute, catastrophic, or unplanned. What does recovery look like? Doctor, I understand I had a stroke. I know right now I can't see out of this side of my eye and I'm having a hard time with this left leg. What does recovery actually look like? What does it look like? This is a very broad question, but you'll get a lot of information from your care team regarding this. If you had a stroke, for example, and you asked that to your medical doctor, your physical therapist, and your nurse, you'd get a ton of information about what you expect the next 3 to 6 months of your life to look like. So highly recommend that. What does recovery look like? What can be done to support the recovery process? So that's a follow-up question from my last most important question there, very important question about recovery. Especially if you're a care partner, what can be done to help support my loved one or my person? And in reverse too, if I'm the patient, what can be done to help support me? What do I need at home? What am I going to need to get me through this? And then the big one to focus on is what happens after discharge. So big important thing is, what are you going to need? So caregiving for meals, medications, and mobility. Those are my 3 M's. I think they're always very important when you're talking about transitions and discharging from the hospital. Are you going to need, and I know it's under the umbrella of caregiving, but meals, medications, and mobility. So how are you going to get around? How are you going to get around your home? How are you going to get around outside of your home? How are you going to get your groceries, essentials, your food, your meals? How are you going to get that prepped? And even if you're physically functional from a mobility perspective, anytime you spend an encounter in the hospital, that is exhausting. So there is still a time frame after your stay that you're going to still be recovering. And some of these activities of daily living, like grocery shopping and meal preparing and picking up medications, reading your medications, organizing them, suck a lot of energy out of you. And you have to conserve as much as you can to physically heal from whatever physical issue you had. So I cannot stress enough how important it is to understand what would be understanding what would be beneficial for what you're going to need when you go home, and not just specific to your medical needs. Think of it from a big picture, holistic perspective. What would you need to have your best recovery? What can the people in your life do to help support you? What can you offload to them? And very commonly, these meals, medications, and mobility are three things that your family and friends can absolutely help with. And then the second thing that's really big to focus on is, are there therapies that are going to be needed to help along the way in your recovery? And kind of follow-up question from that is, can I do them at home? So would it be appropriate for me to have a home health care or go to day rehab or just physical therapy sessions? Or do I need to do something a little bit more intensive at a nursing facility or a more intensive rehab institute? What am I looking at from a physical recovery perspective and a rehab service perspective after I'm discharged from the hospital? So there's a couple things to really consider. I think that the hospital community does an excellent job of helping people understand their medical conditions with a lot of medical education and specialists and fancy medications and treatments. But it's very important to understand what is all of the collateral supports or the collateral damage that has happened due to whatever has brought you into the hospital. And a lot of times those fall under those caregiving essentials and those rehab needs after discharge. So as promised, a little bit more detail regarding the electronic medical record. So when you talk about getting into how do I find out information, when do I find out information, I think that this is your number one tool. Like I said, it is less common to find somebody that isn't on a medical record of this sort. Most agencies or organizations have adopted an electronic medical record, the most common, again, being MyChart. And it usually has an option for a proxy person or your caregiver to have access. If that is an option with the organization that you receive healthcare at, this is another planning in advance thing you can do. If you have a decision maker designated, or if you don't, but you just know you have a person, you have a spouse, you have a daughter, you have a sibling, somebody that helps support you with these things, you can grant people access, proxy access or caregiving access to your medical record as a care partner. They might not be called care partners where you receive care, but your emergency contact or your significant other or your care partner, or proxy access is used very commonly, the language proxy, so it's not you, it's your proxy looking at your medical record. It is important to set that up in advance if you want them to have that real-time access to your medical records. Now, this is not required, but it is a bonus when you're talking about accessing information. Additionally, it is something that could be set up in a more acute event as well. So if you had an unplanned admission, or if you decided to do it once you got to the hospital for some reason for a planned admission, that's an option as well. But it's important, if you don't know, to ask, is there an option to see my electronic medical record? Is there an option to have my care partner access my electronic medical record? And if there is, what are the directions for that? They usually send a link with directions or a handout with step-by-step directions on how to access that. It is important to note that many times this is access through an app on your smartphone or tablet. There's almost always an application option for this, which makes it pretty simple if you have one of those smart devices. But the other option is through a web browser. Occasionally, that's the only option, but you can also access through the old school internet option where you could just log in from a browser. So sophisticated way, but something to consider when you think about what tools do I have. You can plan this one a little bit more in advance. And it's not the only way. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way here. It's not the only way to get information about what's going on with your care or your loved one's care. There's definitely other ways to engage. So it's not the only option, it's just one option and a newer, more robust option. You always want to make sure that you ask for the phone number to the nursing unit. I do recognize that you can call a main number. Many times operating systems are voice toned, so you're not talking to a real operator, or you have to wait a long time to speak to a real operator. The other reality is that sometimes people get bounced around when you're calling a main number. So as a point of convenience and time saving and organization, it is really important to figure out or ask, what is the number to the nursing unit? So once you get settled into your room, that's one of the first things that you should ask. When your nurse is getting you all settled and admitting you to your bed, to your room, it's a really appropriate time to ask, can I have the phone number to the unit here so I can give it to my loved one, or to ask on your loved one's behalf if you're at the bedside. It's easy to call the number directly. You typically will get some type of direct contact with either a charge nurse or a unit secretary, somebody that's sitting at the desk, and it's one less step of that routing process, and they can get you right over to the assigned nurse. You can always call general information to be able to contact the direct care nurse, and they can give you updates on what's going on. And that's pretty much the easiest way to do it. And then also, it's really important to understand visiting hours. So although hospitals have had varying in visiting hours, it's not something that's universal across the industry. They were much more liberal pre-COVID. So before the pandemic, you could access your family or have your family come visit you at the hospital much more liberally for much longer periods of time prior to the pandemic. So one thing that's really important, especially now, is to understand what the visiting hours are. So you have to ask about unit-specific hours. So just because one unit has certain hours doesn't mean another unit has specific hours. So I always try to explain to people that if you have a room move, you're going to want to revalidate that with your assigned nurse. And also, there's just some hospital-wide policies, depending on where you receive your care, about accessing patients and visiting. There's also rules about the number of patients or number of visitors as well. So not just hours, but how many people. So keep in mind, if you're having a lot of visitors in, you might have to swap. You might have to, have one person leave and go wait in a common area and another person come in, et cetera. But that's always an option. I can tell you that one thing I have heard more recently is the healthcare industry really pushing to try to make special accommodations depending on the circumstances. So if there's really catastrophic events or if situations are very sensitive, then typically accommodations will be made based on the situation and the circumstance. Outside of that, because we know it's very important for people to connect with their loved ones, but there are kind of standard set hours and number of people that can visit based on the unit that you are located in. And then I'd like to plug, just from a communication perspective, that seeing your care team members face-to-face while visiting your loved one is the best way and a fantastic way to stay involved in the care. That is usually followed up with a question about, when do I go? When is the doctor going to be there? And that's the age-old question that I have not been able to answer since I became a nurse 20 years ago. So that is hard to track them down. I can tell you a lot of doctors do round earlier, or specialty doctors round earlier in the morning at my organization, but that's not specific, or that's not true everywhere. You know, it's really dependent on what's going on that day and who's rounding and whatnot, but it is always helpful to catch people. I can tell you that just talking to the doctor is not the most important thing, though. Talking to any care team member is important. You can run through any of those questions with anybody that comes into the room. So that includes any specialist service, any ancillary service, so your rehab therapies, your lab, and anybody, and particularly your nurse. Also, depending on what you need for transitional services, you may be seen by a social worker, case manager, or discharge planner. That's another really important person to speak with. And even if you don't need something really specialized set up at discharge, you can always ask for a case manager or discharge planner to speak with. So there is a good source of information, especially if things do not seem to be lining up or you don't feel like you have all the information. There's a really good resource to go to, because those staff members tend to have the biggest, most full picture of the situation, and are really, really helpful when you want to understand what's going on with somebody's care. So again, face-to-face time is really important. And if you can catch them and ask any of the questions that we discussed already in the previous slide, you're going to get some good information about what's going on with your treatment plan and medical status. So what to know before you actually discharge from the hospital. So some really important things. Now, I know this one comes right at the end, usually, but a list of your prescriptions. So you really have to have a good understanding of what you're going home on from a prescription perspective. We almost always do adjustments to medications while you're in the hospital. It's more often that you'll have a change in either your actual medication or your dose or your frequency. So not just what's the list, thank you, but let's skim through them, understand them, review them with whoever is discharging you. Medications are really, really important to the success of your recovery, particularly taking the right ones at the right time and with the right changes. Medications can be catastrophic if we don't do them the right way when we transition out of the hospital, and we don't want you to have to come back for further services. We want to make sure that you are fully taken care of. Nobody ever wants to be in the hospital. That is not fun. And medications can be very complicated. So not just the list goodbye, but what are my medications? Do I understand them? Do I recognize the changes? And does this make sense to me? When and how to take those medications prescribed, like I said, and then options for managing pain and discomfort. So very commonly, especially if you're having some type of surgical procedure done, you'll have some pain or discomfort. What's your plan for pain? What have the doctors recommended? Sometimes that's over-the-counter medications, your typical Advils and Tylenols. But one thing that's important to kind of cross-check is, do I have those? Did they write me a prescription for those? Do I have them in the house? Do I need somebody to go get them? Because the last thing you want is to not stay ahead of your pain. And considering the process of being discharged, transporting home, whether that's done by a family member or an actual service, and once you get settled in, the last thing you want to do is figure out that you're missing something like over-the-counter pain medication. And then you want to know how to manage any new dressings, devices, or therapies. Again, I think that our teams are typically pretty good at giving information regarding the medical aspects that you're going home with. A lot of times when people are going home with new medical skilled services, they'll go home with some type of transitional support. So a visiting nurse or therapist from the home setting, or you're going to rehab level of care, and you'll have some support with that. But it's still very important to understand what's new from a medical perspective. Do I have a device that's new? Has my device been changed? Do I need some new therapy to do all of the time or for the next 3 weeks? Do I have a dressing or some type of drain or something, and am I comfortable enough with it to get me to the next checkup, to get me to my home health appointment, etc. What is my activity, and do I have any mobility restrictions? So going back to how is my mobility? What am I allowed to do, and what am I able to do? Do I need assistive devices? Do I have those devices? Do I need, things like a cane, walker, wheelchair, etc.? Is there anything I need to know new about my diet? Am I going to have to change what I have at home? Do I need somebody to go to the grocery store? Do I have enough of what I need? Do I need to avoid certain things? Do I need to go home and throw stuff out? is another good question. So anything specific to diet. Ways to assess your progress. So how am I getting better? How do I know I'm getting better? How do I know that there's been improvement for the reason why I came in? It's also really important to understand what follow-up appointments you need with your outpatient care team. So very commonly, we have situations where there's just a list of people you need to follow up on your discharge paperwork. It's very important to understand who those doctors are, especially if they're new. Make sure you have their contact information. Make sure that you're able to make those follow-up appointments, because they are essential to your success when transitioning out of the hospital. Many times there's issues where people have a difficult time getting in for follow-up, so the sooner you call for those, the better. And you can always call your hospital system back to help you with access with appointments. I know that at our organization, we do have a process where we can help facilitate making the appointments for people at discharge, which is very helpful, especially if it's a new provider. But we can't forget, when you're going, if you're going straight home and you don't have any home health care to help support you, or other transitional services to help support you, that you make all of your necessary and appropriate care team appointments. So any old specialists that you have to see, your primary care doctor, and or any new doctors, are really important to make those appointments for follow-up. Even if you're feeling great, that checkoff is very important. The other reality is even if you're feeling fantastic, you will probably eventually need refills on your prescription. So it's important to go back in and do all of that follow-up care as recommended. And then occasionally you also need actual further testing and outpatient treatment. So no longer do we keep people in the hospital anymore for the whole complete treatment protocol. We do a lot of stuff in the outpatient setting, and there's times where people need to wait so much of a period, so many days, so many weeks, and then have another test or have another outpatient treatment. Or maybe there's something new that you've been diagnosed with that will be chronic, and now you need a infusion once every month. So that's something that will have to be set up and arranged. And to do those as soon as possible after discharge, arrange those appointments, is really important point regarding this. And then, of course, not very common, but we have to consider the rare events where people actually get worse. So what's specific to your problem that you were in the hospital for actually would make you want to come back into the hospital or call the doctor? What is the definition of worsening, and that you would need to seek further medical treatment? So that's a lot of information. I know this can be very complicated, but I hope that I shared a bunch of content that would be helpful for you. And unfortunately, a lot of people do wind up in the hospital at one point or another in their life, particularly, like I mentioned earlier, if you're older or if you have high-risk conditions. It's very common to have to seek out hospital care. So I hope that I shared something with you that you'll be able to take with you and prepare. So if you do wind up in the hospital, navigating through that will not be as much of a distressing situation and be a little bit more seamless for you. And with that, I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Katie. That was great information. And we've already have a couple of questions for you. Before I read those to you, though, I just want to get the reminder into all our viewers. If you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that I can see it and read it to Katie. So, Katie, the first question we have here is from Kirsten. Is there a way to register your healthcare documents with your care system ahead of time in case you don't have them with you when you're admitted?
Yes, you absolutely can do that. So I will note that there are a lot of systems where there is fragmentation. So you may have a primary care doctor that is affiliated with your hospital system, right? So you would be seamless there, but you might have a specialist that is not part of the system, right? So I highly recommend carrying them because it is not a perfect system. But to answer your question, you can. And what I recommend you do is at your regular doctor's appointments, bring those in. Bring them into your specialist, bring them into your primary care office just one time, and they can scan them into your medical record, and they will move across the system with you as long as it's the same system.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. I believe that will answer that question for you. I saw somebody raise their hand. I can't answer those for you. So if you would just type in your question in the Q&A box, I'll make sure that we get that answered. So, Katy, with the patients that you deal with, what are they typically the least prepared for? What should they worry about first?
So I think the most common thing that people are least prepared for is something that I touched on one of my slides. So the caregiving aspect where I talked about medication mobility and meals. I think people are unprepared for things that insurance does not cover, which are very commonly those three things. So anything that we would classify as an activity of daily living is very essential to have good support for and good foundational resources for, but it's typically not something that's covered by insurance. So even if you're walking out of the hospital fairly mobile, all of those things can be very stressful for anybody. So imagine if you had a mobility compromise and could still move around your house, but still couldn't move as fluently as you did prior to your hospital encounter. I find that the most common things that people are unprepared for is that circumstance. They didn't plan for who's going to help me at home, who's going to check on me, who's going to help me with groceries, who's going to fill my medications, who's going to help me get around the house while I recover for 2 or 3 weeks. Or in the unfortunate circumstance, some people just over time have more issues with mobility, other activities, daily living, like managing their medications. As you get older and you have multiple chronic conditions, the number of medications you're taking can be incredibly difficult and complex, but just managing them. When do you take them? Setting up a pill box, that's all activities of daily living. And prepping my meals, for example, doing my laundry, doing my house cleaning, those are all very important things. They're not as up there as mobility is, but a really quick second below, and can be very helpful if they're outsourced, either paid for. When I say outsourced, I mean paid for, or planned for with long-term care insurance, or provided by a really tight family and friend support system. We've seen a combination of those happen. I've seen a combination of those happen successfully, but the people that have the most success are those that have that pre-planned. And the most common thing I find is that is not thought about. That is an afterthought. People think more about their actual medical diagnoses and treating the medical diagnoses, not the whole picture of what else am I going to need from a holistic support perspective.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We have another question here from Mary. Do you need both a POLST, a POLST, and a living will? If both, what takes precedence?
Yeah, so you do not need both. Like I said, a living will is more general. It's not going to be as detailed. To answer your question, a POLST will take precedent because it has more specific directives, but you do not need both. You can have both, or you can have one or the other.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here from Joe. I was concerned about a senior person going to the hospital from a senior assisted living facility. Are there processes in place from the senior living to communicate to the hospital, especially when the responsible person is not available?
Yeah, so Joe, that's a great question. So that's really tricky, and there's actually some barriers between health systems and assisted living facilities related to your question specifically. And a lot of times, healthcare organizations are prohibited by HIPAA to share that information. I work with our post-acute network, which includes this level of service. So our assisted living facilities in our 911 in our areas. It takes some legwork, but what we recommend are basically waivers signed or consent signed that this medical information can be shared back and forth, but it has to be validated every single time we share information. So if there is a actual care partner designated by a patient, that's the person we have to talk to. If they say, hey, assisted living facility, we want you to manage the care, or we want you to have updates, et cetera. We have developed processes with different organizations, and I've seen this happen pretty successfully, depending on the depending on the assisted living facilities buy-in and capabilities, is delineating that in advance as a consent and an ask to share that information, and basically a waiver to have medical records and medical sharing as a healthcare provider. But since they are not a paid entity and providing a skilled service, it's not covered under HIPAA the same way. So there are constraints with that, and it can be very difficult. And we want to share information to be able to ensure people transition safely and appropriately, but we also have to be very careful about people's privacy and make sure that we keep people's information private that they want private. And this actually just goes back to the same kind of mantra of this entire presentation about being prepared. And if you're in an assisted living facility, there's a good chance that you may need hospital services or medical services in general, and that is something that can be arranged in advance. But typically, we don't just share straight medical information to people that operate an assisted living facility type situation. There are, like I said, some processes that can be put in place to do that sharing, but it needs to be planned in advance. And it's really dependent on the services you're living in, or the services you're providing, and also the level of care we're transitioning the patient back and forth from. It can be difficult, yes.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for that question. And now we have another one from Eleanor. You talked about the power of attorney, but please discuss how your health surrogate fits in.
Yeah, so a health surrogate, at least in Illinois, so I'm in Illinois, Health Surrogate Act in Illinois works specific for hospital encounters. So I didn't go into too much detail about this because it's really only good for an actual encounter of care. So a health surrogate comes into effect when and if we do not have somebody designated for a patient and we need decisions made for the patient because they are unable to make decisions themselves. There is a state statute that we follow, and we enact that statute to designate the decision maker. And it basically, per state law, goes down a line of how there's a relation to the patient, again, starting with spouse and then, maybe parent or sibling or child or whatnot, and it's state specific. And we designate that person as a decision maker if we can get a hold of them and if they are willing to make decisions for that patient, and we designate them as the decision maker for that actual encounter. That document is used more often in a reactionary measure, not in an advanced, like the stuff I talked about today where you're trying to prepare in advance. A power of attorney would be in preparation for, not in a reactionary state where we're trying to find somebody to make decisions and that person was unprepared.
Okay, thank you. And we're almost out of time, but we do have one more question from Richard.
Okay.
And he asks, is there a website that tells you what are the basic items you should have ready if you go to the hospital unexpectedly, or any other kind of resource besides this presentation that will be available for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your local hospital, almost every local hospital has a page like this. If you look and search on where you receive services, that's actually where I'd recommend, because you have the most applicable information to where you would receive services. There is general information when you Google it as well, but almost every healthcare organization has a list of what to bring, how to prepare for your hospital stay. And I would recommend your local place that you receive healthcare services at.
Well, that's good. That's great advice to end on, especially. So Katy, thank you so much for sharing all of these wonderful tips with all of our viewers today. Thank you for sharing your busy schedule with us today. And for all of you who are watching today, we appreciate you taking your time to be with us and kick off the new year with Senior Living Live. This webinar will be available for you to rewatch and to share with others. You'll be getting an email with a link in it from the email that you registered for this webinar. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.